Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to New America. I'm thrilled to see this level of turnout for today's event on how Americans feel about democracy. And I'm Mark Schmidt. I direct the political reform program here. I'm gonna immediately turn this over to our panelists. But just to say, I think what's distinctive about this event was that we've had a lot of conversations about how Americans feel about democracy and sort of generalized thoughts about it. But what we have here today is two really rigorous examinations of public opinion about public attitudes about democracy, and we thought it'd be a really rich discussion to bring them both into the room and liven them up with some other discussion from people who are observing it as journalists, scholars, other perspectives. So one study is the Voter Study Group, which has been supported by the Democracy Fund, and that my colleague Lee Drutman has been involved with, and Henry Olson at the end of the panel. And the other is the Pew Research Center's study on attitudes about democracy. And for me, Pew Research Center has been kind of the gold standard about studying public attitudes for about as long as I can remember. So I'll just we'll start with a couple presentations. First, Lee Drutman, my colleague, who's a senior fellow in our program. Jocelyn Kiley, who is the associate director for U.S. politics at the Pew Research Center. I'm not doing bios. I figure everybody has a supercomputer in your hand if you want to look up more about anybody. Next to Jocelyn is Vanessa Williamson, who is a fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution and has co-written important books about the Tea Party and also about Americans' attitudes about taxation. Perry Bacon Jr., who is a political writer at 538 and has been a fellow at New America, and Henry Olson, who's a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and was also a participant in the Voter Study Group project. So I'll just turn it over to Lee, and I thank you again all for coming.
Great. Thanks, Mark. All right, so hopefully we'll have this PowerPoint presentation will come up. This is the report. I think there are copies outside. And so we'll start with the good news, because everyone loves a little bit of good news. This shows that the top line is percentage of Americans who say we should have a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with Congress and elections. And actually, our analysis shows that is actually down from where it's been. So that's good news, although there's a little bit of slight increase in the red line, which is support for Army rule. So that's the good news. The sort of discouraging news is we actually asked 5 statements in this survey on support for democracy, and only 15% or 54% of people gave the pro-democracy answer on all 5 questions. So support for democracy might not be super strong. Now, I mean, obviously, there's a question of these polls being a snapshot in time, and if you wanted to take a broader historical lens at this, you might say, well, hasn't there always been a sort of not super pro-liberal democracy core of the American electorate? And yeah, that's true. In fact, after World War II, it was a sort of panic among social scientists after they wondered, could it happen here too? The it then being the rise of Hitler, and they probed the attitudes of the American electorate and found that, yeah, maybe support for tolerance and liberal democracy was not that high. And in fact, I'll show you 2 slides from 2 graphs from this report that actually would not have been surprising to the social scientists of the 50s and 60s. One is that having a rather traditionalist views of American identity are pretty highly correlated with not thinking government's such a great system, or not thinking democracy is such a great system, and thinking a strong leader is pretty good. And also a sense of there being disorder and chaos in the world. Uncertainty might lead you to not think democracy, a strong leader is particularly good, although it's not super correlated with support for democracy. So again, there is a sense that this has always sort of there's been a persistent rumbling of anti-democratic sentiment in the broader American electorate. So what's the broader question to ask is, well, what's different now? I mean, one has to do with the elites. in that you have, in the past, the American elites who lead both parties have always been, bulwarks and teachers of American liberal democratic norms. And, maybe it was, we got lucky. And then there's also the question of the party system itself, in which for a long time there was no party that was really the natural home for the country of attitudes that often cohere around authoritarianism. Now, one, I think, particularly interesting finding from our report is that when you break down by attitudes on economics and on social issues, that the highest support for democracy is those who hold consistently liberal attitudes, and the sort of weakest support for democracy and strongest authoritarian, those who are sort of off dimensions, that they sort of don't really have a party that represents them, or also in the middle. And these are people who tend to be sort of less attached to the party system, less educated overall. Another key finding that I think really jumps out is the fact that folks who were either Obama-Trump voters or other Trump voters or just other, they didn't support either of the two major party candidates, are most likely to support strong leadership, tend to be most disaffected with the political system. And I think this kind of creates a challenging question about what do we do about this broad anti-democratic sentiment that's out there. It's not the vast majority, but there is a significant percentage of the population who holds these views. And one idea is, well, maybe this is about civic education and voter participation, and we just need to bring more people into this system. But then this creates I think a challenging question, which is if we're asking for more engagement from people who feel unconnected to the parties and hold negative views of democracy, then there are some risks. One is that we bring in people who hold these anti-democratic sentiments, which further increases the electoral power of an anti-system populist candidate who wants to blow it all up. Maybe that person is already Donald Trump. And the second is that, or people just get more caught up in the two parties, which are deeply polarized. And then there's, I think, an even bigger challenge, which is, I think, one thing that we find in this data, and I think it also comes out in the Pew data, is that you're seeing more polarization between the parties on views of democracy as a system and basically liberal democratic norms. And maybe Democrats gained tremendously among moderate Republicans in 2018 and 2020, and that leaves the Republican Party as the party of the Ted Cruzes and the Steve Kings and the Roy Moores and the Louis Gohmerts, and then things, I think, start to get really contested. Then the other question that you ask is, well, is there a way to shift the axis of political conflict back from a battle over the nature of American identity and its political institutions and to more non-existential normal politics over, public policy and its implementation, the size of government, economics? And I think the answer is that that's really hard to do given the way the current party system is aligned. But we have to think about ways so that to change the current status quo so that being a Democrat or being a Republican is not wrapped up in these fundamental zero-sum questions about the basis of American democracy. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, great. Well, I think I'll talk a little bit about, I think in many ways, a complementary set of work that we've done at the Pew Research Center. So let's see, oops. Oh, I think I may need some tech assistance.
There you go.
There we go. All right. So we study some of these questions fairly regularly, and earlier this year we did a wide-ranging study on the public's attitudes about not just democracy and some of the kinds of questions that Lee asked about, but individual types of democratic values. And so I'll start with some broad views here. As you can see, there's some criticism about the way democracy is functioning these days. So we have a majority of Americans saying that democracy is functioning at least somewhat well, but just 18% saying that it's functioning very well in the country today. And when we ask a different kind of question, which I consider a sort of high bar, thinking about the fundamental design and structure of American government, do you think there need to be significant changes or not? 6 in 10 Americans say there need to be significant changes. So, as I say, not exactly a low bar question. But what you can see here is that these attitudes do split by partisan lines, that Republicans are less critical of the current state of democracy than Democrats. Still, they're not overwhelmingly positive, right? 30% of Republicans say that the democracy is functioning very well, and Republicans are divided on the question of whether fundamental changes need to happen or not. And I think it's also important to put this in context. These kinds of questions, even though we don't have a trend on this particular question, we ask these particular questions, we asked these for the first time this year, we do know that questions like this tend to reflect whether you're the in party or the out party. So Republicans are in power, Democrats are less satisfied with democracy, more likely to want to see structural changes. You know, when we see questions about trust in government that do have long-term trends, for instance, we see when Republicans are in power, Republicans are more positive. When Democrats are in power, Democrats are more positive. So I think just something to think about when we interpret these questions. But let's move on to some specifics. So one of the things that we did was we asked people about 23 separate kinds of political values that get at democratic ideals. And you can see here that on all 23 of them, majorities said these things were very important for the US. But on only 8 of 23 did the majority of Americans say that the US is even doing somewhat well when it comes to this particular value. So you can see that disconnect. And these are just a couple of illustrations of what it is, what it is we asked about. So you can see, for instance, the first over to the left, that the rights and freedoms of all people are respected. 84% of Americans say that that's very important for the country, yet only 47% say that describes the country either very well or somewhat well. So again, not a particularly high bar to say it describes the country somewhat well. You can see that same kind of disconnect on this question of whether elected officials face serious consequences when there's misconduct, right? And you see similar size gaps when you ask people about whether the government is open and transparent, or whether there's bipartisan cooperation, or the tone of political debate is respectful, or any number of other questions. You do, as I say, there are 8 of 23 where a majority say we are doing well. So here's one example that people are free to peacefully protest. So that's one that people say is important, and also people say, describes the country very, very or somewhat well. So there's not a disconnect over every single one of the values we ask about, but for the majority of values there is. And I want to talk a little bit about this partisan divides. As Lee said, this is all happening against a backdrop of increasing partisan polarization in the country today, and you see partisan divides even in these evaluations of how well the country is doing in terms of these democratic values. So I'll focus in on just a couple. This set up here are ones where Republicans are more likely than Democrats to say it describes the country well. And Democrats, you can see for the most part, a minority of Democrats say everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed, the rights and freedoms of all are respected, that the views of those who are not in the majority are respected. Those are attitudes that Democrats are less likely to hold than Republicans. At the same time, one of the few areas where Republicans are more likely than Democrats to express criticism is around the news media in the political environment. So Democrats are not particularly positive in these evaluations of whether the news media favor a political party or not. This is something that I think majorities of both Democrats and Republicans don't think is something that describes the country well, but the critique is more widespread among Republicans than among Democrats. But I want to focus here for a moment on some of these in the center of this table here, just to show you that there is bipartisan agreement over a number of these democratic values, and the bipartisan agreement is that it doesn't really describe the country all that well these days. So again, some of the ones I listed before, that the government is open and transparent, only about a quarter of both Republicans and Democrats say that describes the country well right now. That the tone of political debate is respectful, that money doesn't have great influence in our political campaigns, the question about misconduct for elected officials, this question about whether people can agree on basic facts even when they disagree on politics. And that's something we see in other polling that we really do see that people are perceiving not just that we disagree on politics, but that we disagree on the facts. And again, here on whether the two parties can work together. So people tend to think of these as elements of a functioning democracy, and yet they don't see us living up to them right now. And I wanted to close out or talk a little bit more about this widespread negativity and cynicism and sort of how that forms a backdrop of these debates we're having about democracy. What I'm showing you here is the confidence that people express in different kinds of groups in American society, and you can see elected officials are all the way at the bottom here, that just 25% say they have at least a fair amount of confidence in elected officials to act in the best interest of the public. But this finding isn't new to this moment, right? We've seen this before. We asked this question in about 2 years ago, and we saw a similar finding. So there's a sense that there might be a sense among some that the negativity or the cynicism is unique to this particular moment, but I don't think that's entirely true. And here's another example of this. This is a nice long trend asked in the national election studies about whether the government is run by a few big interests who are looking out for themselves or for the benefit of all people. And you can see pretty clearly for the better part of the last 2 decades, 3/4 of Americans have said that the government's run for the benefit of a few big interests. That dip is around September 11th, when there was a little bit of we saw trust in government increase post-September 11th, but it didn't take too long for the American public to move back in the direction of having a cynical view here. One of the other findings we have is that people are not just more cynical about government, they're also more cynical about their fellow citizens, right? So today you can see here that a majority of Americans now say they have not very much or no confidence in the wisdom of the American people to make good political decisions, right? But if you go back to the 1990s or 2007, the majority view, or more people held the view that they had at least a good deal of confidence in their fellow citizens when it comes to this. So again, it's not specific to democracy, but I think it's an important part of the debate around democracy today. And then I'll just close with this, which again might not seem like it's specifically about democracy, but it's a question we first asked in 2016 about whether you yourself feel like you're winning or losing in politics when it comes to the issues that matter these days. And the reason I include it is because you can see here that the majority of people think that they're losing, and it doesn't matter whether, it matters a little bit if you're actually winning, right? So in 2016, Democrats were more likely than Republicans to say they were winning in politics. Still, though, Democrats were about evenly divided. And today, Republicans are more likely than Democrats to say they're winning, but still, Republicans are a little more likely to say they're losing than winning. So why does this matter? I think it's because a kind of sense of aggrievement, a sense that democracy isn't working for you, kind of pervades American sentiment about politics these days. And the survey that we did includes a lot more specific questions about how you'd feel about, say, increasing the size of the House or the Senate or certain kinds of other electoral college reform. And I think those are all important questions and interesting findings about the public, but I think it's also just important to understand when we talk about public opinion around democracy and democratic values that it's against this broader backdrop. So.
Thank the panelists again for a fascinating presentation and a genuinely fascinating set of reports. I think it's so valuable to have data on a question that I think all of us and so many Americans have speculated on in recent years. How Americans feel about the form of government that they have, how Americans feel about the way that our politics is unfolding. And so, it's wonderful to have data to sort of address some of those speculations. And of course, I think longer term, of course, on many of these questions, you'd want to see longer trend lines, right? And this is something that I think is, in a way, it's unique to this moment that we are asking these kinds of questions of Americans. I think it actually says something about our politics that we did not actually think it was worth asking this before. So in any case, I think it's wonderful that we're moving in the direction of having a better sense of these sort of deep questions about Americans. I want to focus on just a couple of things. First of all, on the question of American cynicism or pessimism about their political institutions. I was torn on how to feel about that, because on the one hand, I thought it suggested a certain clear-eyed concern. I think many political scientists, including myself, feel that there are some substantial challenges to our democratic processes in this country, and so seeing that reflected in the survey data, of course, there's a way of looking at that as a positive phenomenon, kind of clear-eyed phenomenon on the part of the American citizenry, at least the majority of it. But at the same time, of course, political sciences would also be able to tell you that pessimism or cynicism can often lead to apathy, right? So that people recognize there's a problem that doesn't actually necessarily spur them to try and solve it if they don't see it as a problem that's really capable of being addressed. So I think that there's sort of two ways of reading that data, and I'm not sure where, I don't know if you guys, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts about where you come down on that divide. Just the two other things I thought in reading the reports. One, I thought it was fascinating that there's a very, very high percentage of Americans who think that substantial changes need to be made to our political procedures. But if you put before them any of a wide array of political procedures that have been sort of debated at one point or another, they are extremely unpopular. People do not want to readjust the apportionment of the Senate. People, there are all these sorts of ideas that might address some of the inequities of our political system, and they don't go over well. And they don't go over well even after you give people more information about the inequity that it would address. And so I was thinking about that, and there are a couple things I'd say about it. One, I think in general, people are better at judging outcomes than processes, and tend to judge processes in terms of what they think it would do for the outcome. But political processes often have counterintuitive implications. There are all these efforts in American history to sort of reduce the power of political parties, and you find this actually can be quite anti-democratic to do this. It creates more elite power in certain ways. So because the impact of certain procedural changes can be counterintuitive, I think it's reasonable that people are suspicious of these changes. It also suggests that a part of a long American tradition of sort of the civic religion, the idea that Americans are deeply invested in their form of government in a way that other countries are perhaps a little bit less sort of romantic about, right? So I think there's certain things I would personally choose to change about the way that our democracy is structured, but I do have a sympathy for that sort of romantic attachment to a very long-standing democratic form. Finally, the last thing I'd say is one reason you might not be seeing, people will think that there should be big changes, but any big changes you present they are not really excited about, might be really due to elite leadership or lack thereof. I think one thing that is, well, kind of definitional is that people who are in political power today won in the current system and therefore have relatively little incentive to attempt to change the rules. And so I think that for the kinds of reforms that have been put forward to really sink in and become something that a wide swath of the American public is aware of, you would need elite leadership sort of pushing those ideas forward, and there's a pretty strong incentive for at least elected officials not to do that. The last thing I'll say is on attitudes and behavior, and I think sometimes we tend to only look one way. We imagine that people have certain attitudes and therefore behave in certain ways. So you might think that well, people are disenchanted with the political outcomes they receive, and therefore they don't vote. But there are also ways in which your behavior shifts your attitudes, right? So we see this in all kinds of ways. Getting involved in a social movement actually makes you more committed to the cause. Many people who are activists in even really, you would think, very deeply felt causes like opposition to abortion came into the movement, social science has shown, not actually that opinionated on the subject. They got brought in through their church group, they got brought in through friends, and over time of being politically active, they became more engaged in that issue. So I think sometimes it's worth thinking about how we might broaden political engagement, broaden democratic experience for people. Not because one thing that happens when you have democratic experiences, it changes your ideas about whether democracy can work. So, so just sort of to provide at least a little bit of an optimistic endpoint, I think that one way that we might reduce the sort of pessimism that we see in the system is giving more people an opportunity to participate in that system.
Reading these reports, and also because I work at 530 and we're very data obsessed, I looked up some more data because I was just curious about this. So I'll start here. And Gallup collects what they call data on confidence in institutions. And they poll people in different institutions every year. And so I wanted to look at this briefly because it tells you some sense of like democracy in part comes to institutions. And I wanted to look at this and do a little bit of comparison data. So they looked at confidence in institutions, and I'm going to focus on the very little number, meaning you're not very confident in this institution. So in 2008, 26% of people had very little confidence in newspapers. That makes me very sad. But in 2018, 38% did. So that makes me even sadder. So that showed support of newspapers is going down. The military, on the other hand, very little, 2008, 7%. Very little confidence, 7%. In 2018, very little, 5%. So the military has maintained public confidence, in other words. Similarly, the presidency. So in 2008, 41% of people say they have very little confidence. 2009, you're down to 19%. You can sort of figure out why. 2016, 33% of people have very little confidence, so they've lost support for Barack Obama, presumably. And in 2018, 40% of people have very little confidence in the presidency. So Bush was actually slightly more unpopular than Trump by that measure, but it tells you something about how people see the presidency and how that's less support for. The medical system is still supported. Banks actually have very little decline in support for banks, even though you would think differently. Television news. In 2008, 28%, very little confidence. In 2009, 31%, very little confidence. In 2018, 41%, very little confidence in television news. So that's another decline. Interestingly, the police in 2008, 10% had very little support for them. And in 2018, 14%. So despite what you see in the news, the police have actually not lost a lot of public confidence. I'll have to look at some more polls on that, but I thought that was an interesting finding. News on the internet. In 2014, 29% of people have very little confidence. In 2017, 42% of people have very little confidence. So again, I assume that's the Facebook and the fake news problem. A couple more. Organized religion, 15%, very little confidence in 2008, 24% in 2018. So you've seen some decline. It's not surprising. Let's see, a couple more that I wanted to. Supreme Court has very similar levels of confidence. Congress, very little confidence, 38% in 2008, so very unpopular. And then in 2018, 46%, very little confidence. So Congress sort of always been unpopular. Organized labor's numbers have not changed very much. Let's see here if there's any other. Big business has not changed very much. Public schools have not changed very much. So that just gives you a sense of, and we'll come back to this in a bit, I'm sure, but it gives you a sense of like institutions. Our democracy is in part a bunch of institutions, and there are a few that are in real decline, and the news media being a very important one that I care a lot about and I think is important to the country. But you're seeing this data among both Democrats and Republicans that they feel like the news media is not doing a particularly good job. The Republican number is really, really high, but the Democratic number is about 50-50 as well, and it's something I think is worth thinking about as we think about how to fix our democracy.
Well, usually I'm the data hound on any panel, but I know when I'm outclassed, so I'm going to throw you all a lifeline of story rather than more data, and talk about what I think is at the back of our heads, which is not where are we now, but where could we be going. I think when you look at history, we have pretty clear patterns of when countries choose to reject or choose to move away from democratic norms towards non-democratic norms. And they fall into roughly two camps. One is the danger that most of the post-war order has been meant to protect against, and that is severe and crippling economic catastrophe. That the Great Depression threw many democracies in Europe into fascism or into other non-democratic regimes, and much of the post-war order was meant in the terms of their design, of the designers, to make sure that people had enough economic stake through the welfare state and through broadly shared economic growth that they'd never want to make that mistake again. But we still see that it happens. You know, Venezuela, Chavez came to power after a nearly decade-long depression brought on by low oil prices and an oil-dependent economy. And the same was true with Putin, that between the economic dislocation of the fall of communism and record low oil prices, people were strong and nostalgic for a strong state and a strong leader, and he was exactly what the Russian people wanted. Now, we don't have that prospect today. in the United States. What our concerns are about, I think, is the second issue, which is the sort of issues where people feel completely unheard and unable to live a life of their own choosing in a regime. That's come up in the past in religious wars or religious conflict. It's come in the past with ideological conflict. And when Lee talks about, can we move away from the questions of identity to the questions of economics, that's really what you're talking about, is that there's increasingly a tendency to see our politics as a quest over values and to see no middle ground, that we either all have to live like coastal California or we all have to live like rural Alabama, and anything in between doesn't make any sense. We've had this in our country before. It's called the run-up to the Civil War, when you had to be either all slave or all free. There were people who tried to bring the country together and tried to create a different principle, but they were unpersuasive at moving the people who were on the extremes, who each of whom dominated one half of the country. So under our system, that meant the middle was squeezed out. So what do I see for us going forward? Well, with respect to the structural changes people can talk about, I think, one, we need to have a structural change in the country that allows a middle to organize more effectively to have their voice heard. And that could be something like ranked voting. That could be something like moving away from the Electoral College and moving towards either a popular vote, approving the National Vote Compact, or approving some form of mandatory proportionality in the awards of electoral code, each of which prevents minorities from using our binary first-past-the-post majoritarian system from gaining control and forcing a question, a decision point that most people would not want to have. But I think the most important thing is for people to step back from the brink, which is, are the questions that we're fighting about, are the questions that are so increasingly divisive on the cultural right and left, really that divisive that it means threatening up the Union? And if not, then what we need to do is not so much move away towards economics, this is where I'd part company from Lee, but rather talk about a new system of American identity where both sides can feel at least partial home, the sort of things that kept America together in the run-up to the Civil War, the sorts of compromises that allowed both sides to feel at home, because otherwise what we'll have is a system of either continued intensification and continued conflict, and that's ultimately going to mean the sort of withering support for a democracy where one side sees that democracy equals complete and total loss.
So try to move this, we'll have a little bit of discussion here. And I mean, I think one of the questions, and Vanessa, you brought this up, is sort of this question about the role of elites in leading this. And I mean, so one obvious retort to all this public opinion data is, well, isn't it elites who sort of drive the conversation? And I'm just kind of want to tease that out a little bit. I mean, I think a lot of the criticisms of American politics are really a criticism of where elites in our party system are leading us. Is that fair, do we think? Are elites trapped by public opinion? Are elites trapped by the party system? Why is nobody stepping back from the brink? Why is there none of the leadership that Henry says that we need?
I guess I could speak a little bit about that. I do think that it's very important to recognize the level of disconnect, and I think this is especially true in the Republican Party, between the sort of policy priorities of the party and the policy priorities of the base. And I think that that's a really striking divide, particularly on the right in this time.
Where do you see that?
Well, I mean, it's certainly true. For instance, I mean, the sort of priorities at the base of the Republican Party have been, and I saw this in my Tea Party work, and have been since, on questions of cultural attitudes, immigration, xenophobia, and racism, sort of as sort of core motivating concerns in the Republican base. And at the top, I think you've seen a willingness to use those concerns for electoral gain, and then sort of policy priorities to some extent certainly within the Trump administration on immigration, but in Congress on tax reform, which was in no way a Republican-based priority. Something like 2% of Republicans thought that taxes needed to be reformed at the time the tax legislation was moving through, and there's a great deal of data to suggest that the majority of Republicans did not think corporations should have their taxes go down. So there is an important sort of disconnect there that I think is worth thinking about when we're looking at political outcomes versus public attitudes. And this is true across the board. This is not just a Republican concern, although I think it's particularly striking right now within the Republican Party. Policy outcomes are not particularly well explained by public attitudes, as a rule. And that, you would like it to, is there some sort of a naive version of democracy where you're like, well, first most people think something, and then politicians enact that. Well, I mean, we all know that that's not true. Then you would have seen movement on all sorts of things like background checks for guns, an increase in the minimum wage. There are all sorts of policies that have overwhelming popular support and don't move forward very quickly. So, so I think it's important to not look at our policy outcomes and reflect that naively back onto the American people. And it's actually one of the reasons I think this data is so valuable, because it actually looks at what people think. It doesn't just look at our policy outcomes and then assume that that's what most people would prefer.
I mean, I think that you're right about the disconnect between the elite and the Republican base. I think that's in part, a large part, why Trump won the nomination, was that he was talking about concerns that people had that the elites wanted to ignore. I think that the elites in Washington, maybe not even the elites in the Republican Party, but the elites in this town are much more concerned with issues of tax reduction and deregulation than anybody in the Republican Party. I did a work on the factions in the Republican Party where basically you could empirically prove that in the nominating process only about 10% of Republicans prioritize government reduction and tax reduction. But yet that always seems to be what people here want to do. Donald Trump could very well have been said to have been the person who ran against every single one of the party's orthodoxies and still managed to capture the party. I would say, though, that ultimately, because we have a relatively transparent system, that people's broad preferences, although they're not specific policy preferences, do break through. And that's because we have open primary systems where the elites can't control completely the nomination. You almost had Bernie Sanders taking out Hillary Clinton. You've had rogue candidates who influence the party parties very seriously, even if they lose. Think Howard Dean, running as the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. Since then, every Democrat has tried to track over to represent the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party, even if imperfectly so from those people's perspective. So I'd be a little more confident in the ability over time of broad public sentiment to break through. But ultimately, it requires a political entrepreneur to see that, like a Reagan in the 60s, or a McGovern early in the 70s, or in this sense, Donald Trump, who can see that and bring it to bear rather than it being something that the party bosses themselves see and then shift their party in the way that John Kennedy was, where the party bosses said, well, we need to get the Catholics back from Eisenhower, so let's put up a Catholic. They could control it then. They can't now, so now it needs some form of new elite to supplant an old elite.
Where does that elite come from?
From active political or active, ambitious people, where entrepreneurs usually come from, people who have an idea and have access to the means to promote the idea, and they test the marketplace.
Yeah, I mean, I would also add here that I think some of these expressed preferences, and Vanessa, you nodded, are different than behavioral preferences, either because the expressed preference doesn't perfectly capture the moment, the full spectrum. And I'm thinking about this in terms of, no matter how many times you ask, how many different ways you ask Americans if they'd like a third party, if they'd like a moderate middle, they're like, yes, absolutely, I want that. But dig just a little bit deeper, right? And they want it in the abstract. They don't want it in the specific, right? When you ask people about compromise, as we have this finding on compromise, you ask people, do you want Republicans and Democrats to compromise? Yes, I do want to see compromise. We did a big study on polarization a couple of years ago that when you ask people what compromise means, we had a question where we said, take a pie, it's essentially a pie from 0 to 100. If Obama's compromising with Republicans, how much should Obama get? How much should Obama and the Democrats get? How much should Republicans said Republicans should get 60% and Democrats should get 40%. I'm not saying, but you find this disconnect, and Democrats the same too, right? So compromise doesn't mean the same thing to everyone, and that sort of that sort of compromise means I get more is found more among the people who are most ideologically consistent, most active in politics, all of these things, and all of that influences the political elites, right? You have people who want to see changes, but you can't quite figure out what those changes are.
So our ideals, we have certain ideals about how democracy works, but those ideals, when they butt up against the reality of the actual democratic process, there's a clash there. And is it that we should have a more realistic view of the democratic process, or that the democratic process should more closely reflect our ideals?
Well, if I can jump in on this question of compromise for just a minute. I mean, one thing that's worth bearing in mind is that there are some things upon which we should not compromise. And I think that the example of slavery that you raised earlier was a very good one. The idea that the positive outcome for American democracy would have been additional compromise over slavery, I think it would not be a view held by a modern person, right? And so I think similarly in the modern time, the idea of compromising over who counts as a citizen or who gets to vote, these are not issues upon which there is a pie to be shared. There is simply you believe in a breadth of the American community or you do not. And so I think that one of the really deeply worrying things about the contemporary moment is that the issues on the table are, on some level, issues that are beyond the question of democratic compromise because they are about the fundamental idea of democracy.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's right. But I also think even the questions that are not like that get pulled into that. So you can, there are different types of issues, but even things upon which, like, what should the marginal tax rate be, becomes something upon which you have these,
Well, they become caught up in an unthinking partisan identity, and if partisanship is caught up in these fundamental questions of what does it mean to be an American citizen, what is American identity, and that's the core question becomes: is there a way to make that not at the center of our politics, and how much of the confrontation over that is exacerbated by putting it at the center of our politics, or are we just on an inevitable crash course between two very different values of what America should be, in which case then we really are in the 1850s all again. Are we in the 1850s? Discuss.
That's an interesting question. Because I liked what you said, and I agree with you that the goal we need some kind of national identity. I agree with you. I hear politicians try to discuss that. Like in 2004, I'd argue Barack Obama's speech was trying to get in that zone. A lot of Jeb Bush's speeches in 2016 were trying to get in that zone. The mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, is talking about running for president. And he was interviewed by Vox, and he said what Henry said 5 different ways: national identity, too divided, and so on. But I was thinking, when Kamala Harris says abolish ICE, and you give this soup nuts of, she's going to win. That was kind of what I thought at the end. It's like, I'm not sure. Someone's got to have a compelling vision of what a national identity sounds like, and that's really hard. And it's going to be really hard when the president sets so much of our policy vision. The incentives in a primary always start to run to the base that exists already. Donald Trump's not showing a good model. I don't see Senator Warren or Bernie Sanders doing that either right now. And so I'm not sure I can articulate what a national identity sounds like. And there's a Atlantic, some more, I'll be on the numbers after this, but this Atlantic poll today jumped out at me too. It's an Atlantic PPR survey that asked people, America is becoming a majority non-white nation. How do you feel about that? 64% of people said that's good. 31% said that's bad. If 31% said that in the poll, to a pollster, I'm guessing that number is higher than 31% in real life. And so the fact that they're uncomfortable with a non-majority white nation, and that number is probably in the 40s, let's say. In other words, I think the goal should be to have a national identity. I'm a little nervous about what a national identity how to create that in a country that's becoming less white, less Christian, more urban. I'm not sure that's what that sounds like. That's the core question. He asked the right question. I'm not sure what the right answer is.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't know what the right answer is, and that's part of why you increasingly find people trying to say this is the question. One aspect is people have to feel that, I think one reason why people would be scared of that change is because they don't know what place they have. And when you listen to some people, you wonder, if you're an Orthodox Christian, do you have a place in the America as envisioned in this people? And of course, the flip side is true on the left, is when you listen to people like Roy Moore, you think, well, I'm open to, don't believe that American Christianity is central to American identity. Do I have a place in your America? But one of the problems, I think, is that a lot of people try and avoid answering the question while saying, can't we all get along? Right. And what we know from history is that fails. Because, as you said,
we've been trying it and it hasn't worked.
We've been trying it and it hasn't
worked.
worked.
8 years of it, and I would argue it didn't work very well. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think that's
and
exactly.
I don't mean to criticize him. I don't think that project, the way he framed it,
and
worked.
Bush ran as a uniter, not a divider. So we have 16 years of people who tried to create a new identity without actually expressing a new identity where people on the sides of the divisions could see themselves having a home. So that means, to answer Lee's question, I think the likelihood is that we move into greater extremes. Which means a likelihood of more intense partisan conflict and real strains. Because what happens if you have a deep recession in the middle of all of this? We know that radicalizes people. We're having this degree of division when we're basically at peace and relatively prosperous. Imagine what happens if neither of those two things still happen. Which I just think that. It's easy to say we need a new identity. It's harder to describe it, but it has to be one that actually addresses the fears of the people involved and doesn't try and sweep it under the rug, because otherwise the partisans of both sides will simply, and the weakly attached to each of those positions will say, well, that doesn't answer my questions. It's just patriotic gobbledygook.
One kind of example that always sticks in my mind is that it was, I believe, at the year 2000 Republican National Convention. They opened with a prayer, as do the Democrats. One of the days was opened by a prayer from an imam. I think we can all agree that's unimaginable today. And that was 16 years ago. That's actually not that long. 18 years ago. It's actually not that long, right? And so I don't know that you can get back as fast as you got away. That may not work, right? It may be a Pandora's box, but it is really striking the extent to which the rhetoric of the Republican Party on non-Christian religious groups in this country has shifted enormously, just enormously, and in a genuinely short period of time.
Well, to Perry's that poll, that PRRI polling, I mean, my guess is that that divide is also an incredibly partisan divide.
Yeah,
and
say that, but yes.
And to Vanessa's point, that the Republican Party of George Bush was a party that was trying to straddle this division within the party, but also trying to lead the party to be more broadly tolerant. Mm-hmm. And the party of Donald Trump is a party that is trying to be intolerant and communicating that Republican identity is preserving America for white people. And so, I mean, to the point of the Civil War, and if there are any Civil War historians in the audience, I apologize if I bastardize the history, but the 1850s were an incredibly polarizing time where, as the South felt more and more threatened, and because of westward expansion, they hardened their views about how important slavery was, and they began rationalizing slavery in a much more dug-in way. And so, I mean, most countries, most UK, many other countries that had slavery, abolished it in a more peaceful, progressive way. I mean, maybe not entirely peaceful, but they didn't. The United Kingdom didn't fight a civil war over it. It also wasn't as deep a part of their economy. But nonetheless, that because of the way our hyper-partisan system is set up in two binary camps, people are forced into one camp and then forced to subscribe to an entire program and get a sense of what does it mean to be a Republican or what does it mean to be a Democrat. So I mean, I think that speaks to this what I believe is a problem with our party system, that there are only two choices and you have to go into one camp or the other. But that, to Vanessa's point, there and to your word, you know, there are people who are not comfortable with structural. They think there's something wrong with the system, but when you start saying, well, would you support this change? Well, I don't know. That seems a little radical. But then to your other point, right? I mean, there's a sense, well, nobody's actually taking leadership on this. And maybe if we had a conversation about our political system and how anti-democratic it is, and that was a real live conversation, and there wasn't this sort of blind veneration just because we've always done things this way, we're going to keep doing this. I mean, to your point, in the report, right? People are actually like a little okay with structural change now, and I mean, my sense is that Americans always thought we have the best system in the world. Democracy is American democracy, but maybe that's not the case anymore, and if so, that opens up possibilities for change. I don't know.
I mean, I think one of the challenges is, right, like when we talk about the kinds of changes, many of them are ones that empower elected officials or in some way, and people don't want that, right? So, and I think about this a lot, like people love term limits. Political scientists hate term limits, right?
Term limits are terrible.
Term limits are terrible, right? But it's one of the most popular thing when you ask so part of one of the challenges is how do you convince people? Like I'm thinking about the question we asked a couple of questions in our survey about whether the allocation of Senate seats should change, whether the size of the House should be increased, decreased, or stayed the same. And there's some arguments. You know, we asked the question in a couple different ways, Vanessa alluded to, where we kind of make the argument the House was this size back when it was founded. It represented X number of people per representative. Now that ratio is, of course, far different, so there's far less representation. Should it be increased, kept the same, or decreased? And there's as much appetite, or close to as much appetite, for decreasing the size of the House as for increasing, because people don't like politicians. I think this is my read into it, right? But we know people don't like politicians, and so when you say, can we have more politicians, that's probably not a really popular.
People want more constituent service.
Right, people want more constituent service, but I'm just saying this is the uphill battle some of the reformers have in this respect.
But we've also not had a big conversation. I mean, this is still an idea that for most people is, oh, I haven't thought about that.
Yeah.
So people's first reaction is, I don't know, well, keep the status quo. But, you know, we could have a much broader conversation, but, you know, politicians that get elected, system works for them. But, you know, I mean, people don't like their politicians, and you say, well, term limits, well, you know, and my view is, I mean, term limits are a bad idea. We should have elections. Problem is that in about 75 to 80% of the seats, if you win, you're basically the incumbent into the foreseeable future, because most elections are not competitive.
This is the ultimate sign we're at a think tank event, is that after yesterday, we are all adamantly, term limits are terrible. We should not have term limits. Think about yesterday a little bit. But anyway, to make a more serious point, I have a question for you.
Oh, yeah.
So imagine if Hillary Clinton wins in 2016. Does that mean the identity war is resolved because it seems like the Democrats have won it? Or imagine if Marco Rubio or Ben Carson wins, and therefore the presidency, therefore it seems like the identity war has a different feel to it at least. Do you think those would have changed?
It may have a little different intensity, but on the right, one of the reasons Donald Trump wins is because people who don't like Trump see this as, you know, the Flight 93 election.
Right.
I think the issue on the left that I would pose is, on most of the cultural wars issues over the last 40 years, you have either won or are winning. So the question is, what are the terms of the peace that you're willing to offer? The right does not believe that you intend to offer any terms of peace. And I think the winners in the cultural war need to think about, what would Mandela do? That and I say that rather seriously, you know, which is that when the fear of white South Africans was always going to be, if we turn political power over, they're going to come and take our homes and kill our. And what he basically did was say, we're going to take political power and you're going to have equal rights, and we're not going to exert revenge upon you. And over time, of course, that has meant that political power and wealth, to some degree, has moved away from whites to blacks. So what's the terms of the peace? What do Orthodox religious people who have been fighting you tooth and nail every step of the way, what role do they have in your new America? Do they get anything? And if the answer is no, they don't, because that's a violation of right, you should expect them to fight bitterly, and fight till the very end. As Sun Tzu said in The Art of War, you always should leave a path for retreat for your enemy.
I think it might be worth thinking about the ways in which the political commitments of religious people have shifted a great deal. But we have always had very, very religious people in this country. So it's worthwhile to remember that this is a country that, of course, is founded upon religious extremists. So my own, ancestors. And so religion has always played this key role and in the lives of many Americans. But once upon a time, the way that we thought we protected that was by ensuring that the state stayed out of it, and that that Congress would neither implement religion nor ban one. Right? And so I think that when we think about what religious communities in America have sought from government, that's actually shifted a great deal since the 60s and 70s. So I think it's worth remembering that the position that we're at today in terms of the very high levels of political engagement in the conservative right, although I guess it's declined to some extent in recent years. But certainly since the Reagan era, very high levels of political engagement by the Christian right is actually not necessarily like of a piece with all of the history of it. So it's very interesting to think about how the political and religious lines have shifted, I think, over time.
It's certainly the political engagement of people on religious grounds started in the 1970s, really, in response to not necessarily the legislative victories of divorce and abortion and decriminalization of, in some, like California, of same-sex behavior, but the judicial approach. It's Roe versus Wade, and then the fear that that was going to continue led them to say, well, we represent a majority, we can reverse this. I think if today you were going to ask I don't think that most people on the religious right want to advance a theocratic agenda. What they would ideally like is a return to the America of the 40s and 50s, where government was out of religion, but broadly Christian norms governed the sort of interrelation between the sexes that we have back then. Now, they've lost that battle. I think most people recognize that. So then the question is, again, I'll turn it back, what do they retain? For example, if you run a Christian college and your theology tells you that marriage, that same-sex behavior is sinful and that marriage between same-sex couples is sinful, and you're sued by a same-sex couple who have come together in your college, do you have a religious exemption to your policies or to the law of the state that you're in, so that you don't have to allow them to live in the same living quarters that heterosexual married couples would live in? What about people who are talking about traditional gender norms? Do they have a right to remove their children from sex ed curricula that they think are offensive? I can tell you by talking with people on the religious right, they're very afraid that the answer is going to be, no, you can't do that, no, you can't do that, no, you can't do that. And then the question is, when you're afraid, you draw the line very far, to the point where they can't express who they are in the America that the cultural left wants. And so my question to the cultural left is, what can they say in the world that you want to create? How do they feel part of that? Or is the answer really, as stark as it was with slavery, which was you must lose completely, and you must lose immediately? If that's the case, you should expect war. I mean, you should expect political war. Although some of my friends on the right say that since they are all the ones that are armed, that they don't need to worry about war.
are political institutions making this fight more intractable than it has to be?
Somewhat. I mean, I do think that the sort of electoral system that we have encourages a bipartisanship that then allows for what would be called agency capture. That minorities create, basically Donald Trump comes and uses a hostile challenge to take over the institution and then uses the power of the institution to rally soft believers in a, what do you care more about, never Trump versus never Hillary? And the same would be true on, there's plenty of people in the Democratic Party who would prefer not to go to the strong progressive wing, but if Kamala Harris were to, or somebody that strong progressive wing were to win, they would rally around because the alternative is worse. So to some extent, that encouragement toward a pure bipartisan system allows for agency capture and hence an intensification of our challenges.
I agree. Other thoughts? Should we open up to questions?
I mean, in general, I think institutions are, the two parties and the way they're structured are causing more division necessary. But when the question is framed that way, usually I say if we had the Donald Trump party, the John Huntsman party, the Hillary Clinton party, and the Bernie Sanders party, and we had a coalition government of the Hillarys and the Huntsmans, that would probably be a better way to go. Yeah. I don't think on that question there's much compromise, though. I'm not totally sure on the question you just raised. Interesting question. I don't know the answer. If all politics is about identity, which is increasingly the case, I'm not sure, there's much room to compromise there. I think you're right. And I'm not sure what I think the surrender will be eventually be requested will be that it'll be total. I agree with you. Yeah.
But are we putting that identity conflict at the center of the politics because that's who's running that's who's captured the two parties, and that's really the thing that divides the parties the most right now, and that's how the parties are distinguishing themselves and rallying their bases.
I mean, I think the thing I would say is that if you went to political science conferences in the last 2 years, the people who study Latin America are like, it does not look good for you guys, because the presidential system and ethnically defined parties is not the way to go if you want stability. So maybe they're feeling better this year. I look forward to checking in.
The funny thing about the American presidency is constitutionally it's much weaker than Latin American presidencies, but that's not how it's.
What I would say is, look, we have an example of a presidential system that is undergoing a current experiment to see whether or not they can reform themselves, and that's France. And it required a third party, a new party, and it required a leader who actually recognizes the demand for change as opposed to trying to pretend that demands for change don't exist. And we don't know whether Macron is going to be successful or not. But he did navigate a presidential system, created a new party that took disaffected members from the center left, the center, and the center right. And it's basically a bold experiment to see whether or not that can succeed in a system that's not that dissimilar from our own.
Move to the questions? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Do you have anything you want to add?
No, let's open it up for questions.
Okay, let's open it up for questions.
And go for it.
How about the lady in the right there? Yeah, yeah, you. Yes.
So, my question is basically that I hear a lot of talk about partisan divides and things like that, and my biggest question is, since knowing how America was created by rich, white, straight men, isn't the conversation more so about how the system is made by those certain types of people, and how the argument is really about people who want the American freedom that they created for that small demographic, and the tension between these two groups or these two separate people? Do you feel like this divide is more irreconcilable than partisanship arguments, things like that?
I can jump in on that for a minute. I mean, I think that it's such a good point to remind us of the ways in which identity was baked into our Constitution, right? Like I always say, if we're going to talk about identity politics, let's remember the 3/5 clause, one of the purest examples of identity politics that has ever existed. But so I think you're exactly right to see, and it's sort of, we've already heard it. You and I were both already talking about the moment we're in now is an echo of an ongoing series of battles over who gets to be American, and it has not been a straight shot by any stretch of the imagination. I think that Reverend Barber refers to the period we're in as a time that requires a third Reconstruction, right? There was the original Reconstruction post-Civil War that ends in collapse. There's a second Reconstruction in the period of civil rights, and that today is the time for a third Reconstruction. And I think that, I'm certain that historians, would feel uncomfortable with sort of seeing these rhymes in history, but I do think that it is a very valuable way of thinking about the contemporary moment and the challenges we face.
Yeah, and I think more broadly, the Constitution as written does not hold up to today's standards of democracy as an extremely democratic document. Most analysis would say that the Constitution, it was an experiment at its time when monarchy was the standard, and this was a little bit more democracy, but not nearly what we've come to expect. And we've had growing pains as a country as we've tried to expand the franchise and tried to bring in more diverse voices. It's really, the understanding of politics that the framers had was that it was really a consensus-oriented thing. They didn't like parties. They didn't want to have parties. And they thought that you could separate power, and the government wasn't going to do a whole lot, and only it would achieve things through consensus. Now, what do you do in a society in which there's, on a lot of important, complex issues, there's not a lot of consensus? You need to have political fights, and you need to have much more democracy. And the Constitution is at odds with our expectations of what democracy is, I think, and that creates a real challenge that is a through line through American politics and American political reform. Let's try to get another voice from the back there. Yeah.
My question is regarding money in politics and the role that plays. I know it was briefly hit on, but there's a famous study in 2014 from Princeton University that showed that popular opinion doesn't play a major role in policy outcomes necessarily. And then, regardless of Bernie Sanders' actual politics, his campaign, I think, was revolutionary in the sense that it garnered a lot of direct Democratic participation for the first time, and I think that would also be very possible amongst conservatives. And since then, we've seen people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in her grassroots campaign. So do you think these sort of grassroots campaigns on both sides could do a lot to rejuvenate democracy in the country?
Lee, do you want to talk about the Bartels book?
Yeah, the Gillens and Page. Although actually, yes. Although it's funny, I was at a conference at Northwestern where on the Gillens and Page book, and Larry Bartels, who you referenced, who's also done some work in this area, gave a really interesting presentation where he looked at public opinion and policy outcomes across all Western democracies. And so it was not just the US, but it was actually all Western democracies in which public opinion had no relationship to policy outcomes, which suggests that there's something, maybe democracy is not as democratic as we think it is. So, certainly I think money in politics matters. I've done a lot of work on money in politics. I think it clearly limits the range of politicians who can move forward in our political system. Although the ease of internet fundraising may tip the scales a little bit. I don't know. On the is this the birth of a new civic movement? Maybe. I think these things tend to go in waves. It's nothing particularly new. I think we've seen periods of more or less engagement as people have been more or less excited in the democratic process. So I don't see it as being anything revolutionary, just as another iteration of this cyclical engagement. And maybe we have another generation in the 2020s. I think will actually look a lot like the 1960s. That would be my prediction.
The one thing I would add is which I think is just, I think one of the ways in which you're hitting on something is that I think money in politics contributes a lot to the the negative perceptions about politics, right? So you know, one of the things I think thinking about the Democratic primary, you know, what's interesting is the policy positions or political values of people who voted for Clinton and Sanders in the primaries were really not all that different, right? So what was that about? And I think that it was the positioning as an outsider and all that. And to some degree, you know, that was also part of Trump's appeal, right? That he was outside the political system and that he wasn't going to be influenced by people's money in the way that your ordinary politician would be influenced by people's money. I'm just saying these are appeals that the public finds appealing, right? So that doesn't, for all the reasons we've just talked about, it doesn't necessarily mean we're headed into a world of no money in politics. There are a lot of reasons that money maintains a place in the political system, but it's one of the things that Americans hate about the political system is the existence of money. So.
I would say you name 3 people who I think are innovating: Bernie Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez, and one other person. I mean, but we'll probably end up with a Congress next year of 500 people elected with lots of big money contributions and lots of donors that are not in a broad spread, and we'll have like 35 who are elected the other way, and that'll affect, like, it's still galling to me that a lot of Democrats voted for the Dodd-Frank rollback. I'm very surprised by that. If you ask their voters, I don't think most of them were for that, but I think it goes to the power of the money in politics, particularly the banks have a lot of money.
Yeah.
So earlier in the program, you talked a lot about the extreme discontent that the American people not only have for political figures in the government, but also for private corporations. Do you think that private corporations can help strengthen democracy, or at least help the public perception of democracy? Is that possible, and should they?
It's an interesting question that I don't have a strong, I could see the pros and the cons of that, so I guess I might leave it to my fellow panelists to jump in there.
Well, I mean, I think we're entering in a really interesting period in which we have these really mega corporations that are in many ways more important and powerful than some governments. And you know, that there is the emergence of a sort of new type of corporate statesman, a Bill Gates, a Jeff Bezos, a Warren Buffett, who are trying to say, well, maybe we'll try to solve some public problems if government doesn't. You know, I think there are real problems with that because the accountability mechanisms are very different when corporations solve public problems. But you know, I think in the absence of government trying to solve problems, corporations will try to solve problems, and those will create new problems in which people will demand government solutions, and then maybe we'll have a reinvigoration of government.
Yeah, I think that public problems require public solutions. I think that, I mean, Carnegie and some other very rich folks of previous eras have lovely buildings and nice institutions, but I don't think that sort of Gilded Age politics is something that most Americans will look back on as an era of, democratic enlightenment that we should really try and re-achieve.
There's some evidence that a lot of younger people in the crowd, there's some evidence that millennials do not support capitalism at the levels that older people do. And I think we're going to see an interesting campaign about this. One thing Senator Sanders is doing is he repeatedly tweets and highlights how Disney pays its employees. And boy, I should have started there. But so I work at 538, which is owned by Disney. So he's definitely trying to, he's talking about how Amazon pays its workers. He's definitely trying to sort of not only like attack how these big capitalist companies work, but also to, in some ways, suggest that maybe their journalists are co-opted and therefore not covering those issues well. I think you're going to see more attacks on the sort of capitalist system and the big corporations in 2020 that you've seen in previous elections.
Yeah. No, yeah, you had your hand. Yeah, green shirt woman. Yes.
Green shirt woman, yes.
Hi. So earlier, towards the beginning of the panel presentations, there was this mention of democratic experiences. And kind of ending on like a more positive note, talking about how people should be given this opportunity now more to participate politically. And so I guess my question is, in the context of voter suppression laws, like in states like North Carolina and Texas, how are people supposed to participate more when there are laws kind of not allowing them to do so?
Yeah. If I can, I guess I raised the point earlier, so I'd be happy to talk more about it. I mean, I think this is the big fight in a really fundamental way, right, about who gets to participate, because that is the fight that democracy is about. And you know, I just this spring ran a voter registration experiment in Texas. There are exceptionally strict rules about voter registration in Texas that are extraordinarily effective at excluding people from voting. North Carolina is another good example of that. But I mean, if you look at a place like North Carolina, there has also been an striking amount of political organizing to try and reverse some of those trends. Right now, you know, that organizing could have gone into something else. You know, so it's not. I wouldn't say that this is the. You know, if you could choose to pitch the battle elsewhere, why wouldn't you? But I think that you know this. That voting is not the full extent of democratic participation, and that the fight to extend voting rights more broadly, I think, brings many people into politics even when those rights are being challenged, and brings them into politics often in a very deep way. There's my optimistic spin for the day.
Do you want a negative counter?
Looking at me. I knew he was over there. I knew he was over there.
I don't know. I'll just be a little. Well, it's been interesting to watch political science try to kind of estimate the effect of voter suppression laws. And one of the funny things is that there are a number of political scientists who say, you know, we look at this and we don't really see much of an effect on these voter suppression laws in turnout. Actually, it doesn't seem to make much of a difference. Now, well, that's kind of puzzling because it cuts against our intuitions. And you know, part of what's powering that is, well, these are populations that don't really vote at all anyway. Now, you know, maybe they vote, and the laws may affect fewer people than we think they do. Now, in a close election, even just a few people really matter. So these laws really matter. But it does speak to this broader point that even among people who can vote, like a lot of them don't. Young people do not vote. Most of them can vote. There's nothing that makes it hard for them to vote. Except, you know, there's automatic voter registration in a lot of places. Automatic voter registration does not move the needle at all. Since the 1960s, it's become much easier to vote in this country. Many more people are registered, and voting participation is more or less flat. So there's something else going on here also, which is that, you know, people are not excited about politics. Most elections are not competitive. People feel like the parties don't speak to them. There are broader issues here too. I mean, it's not to say that these laws are not inherently discriminatory and anti-democratic, but it's just that there are a lot of bigger issues here about why people are disenchanted from our system.
And I will just also say what I think we all know about voter turnout. The voter turnout is highest the higher up the ticket you go, right? So it's highest in presidential elections, and then in like gubernatorial, congressional elections, and really low at local elections. Those are the elections that like really are affecting your life or someone's life on a day-to-day basis. So there's a big possibility for people to become more. And yet people don't turn out.
On a very negative note, if you read the news in North Carolina, the Republicans do not believe a legitimate outcome is the Democrats winning.
Yes.
And I think we should say that about North Carolina specifically. It is like it is hard to look at that without concluding that they do not believe a Democratic victory is legitimate.
In the glasses there? Yeah.
Two things. One is I would definitely disagree with you, because the reason people don't turn out is because even in democratic states, they make it hard for people so that, you know, they have multiple primaries in New York, and they do that. So I do think that voting and electoral reform could have a huge effect. When they implement ranked choice voting in Maine, turnout went up 10%. So I think part of the turnout problem is because voting sucks. And
You feel like you don't have choices.
and so there's like there are things that feed each other there.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I would argue with that.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to talk about, and I think this kind of maybe ties into it, is you guys were discussing the idea of a national identity, and I'm curious, one, what you think previous national identities were that held us together. The closest thing I can maybe come up with was like Reagan and like good guys versus bad guys. And if that's what you're talking about, you know, I don't. Yeah, it feels hopeless because that is lost. But I'm curious as to sort of how to bring maybe expanding voting, expanding participation, and sort of really listening to everyone into it, and also something that Trump uses effectively is comedy, and how that maybe will, you know, whether you see that playing a role in the sort of the transformation or the forging of a new identity.
And I also think this is going to be our final question because we're at time. So,
I mean, I think when you go back and read the Federalist Papers, one of the things the author of the first Federalist paper starts with is it's wonderful that by chance we're all united in a similar religion and a similar national heritage and so forth. And that at the beginning, the fact that they were all largely English-derived or British-derived Protestants meant that they didn't have to, and once they won the identity battle as to whether they were going to be Republican or Royalist, and hardcore Royalists left the country and went to Canada or Bahamas or something like that, you did have a national identity. I think with immigration, that was another question, that did you have to be descended in some way from that original stock? And we created an identity that allowed for immigrants to be equally as American. You know, Lincoln has a wonderful discussion of that in one of his speeches, I think in Peoria during 1858, about how people who have no descent can see the battles of the founders as their own battles, even though their forefathers weren't here. And I think that's really the question that we're facing again, you know, which is that there has been a default broad Christian background to America's identity. That's no longer the case, and the question is, what takes its place? And it can't be one, you know, I think, you know, a lot of people, particularly when the religious right started to organize in the 70s, wanted to say, that's an irreducible part of our identity. We want to roll it back. That's failed. So then the question is, how do you, much like you had to make room for many different people from many different faiths and identities that were not present at the founding, how do you make room for people in our new cultural diversity? Doesn't mean it's easy, but we've done it before.
You said the Cold War League, is that what you're saying?
oh, I was just saying that's something
curious.
that brought us together for a period of time.
World War II. Like
Yes.
we know that like national identity like gets better when there's an external like
We
force
need
that
an
we
us
can-
versus them.
Yeah,
It's just better to
we
be
just,
them as overseas.
And I think even at the founding, what was our national identity? That we weren't Britain. That we weren't, you know, there was an external there. That was so I think those kinds of national that's when national identity, coherent national identity tends to, we know even experimentally, right? Like one way to reduce partisan polarization is to focus on, like during the Olympics, we know that like partisan polarization, sometimes you can see less expression of that on Facebook or things like that. So that's not really an answer to your question, but I think, you know, it's hard to kind of manufacture a national. I think that goes back to one of the early questions. It's hard.
But I guess, have we had national identity in a form that included non-Christians, women, and blacks in meaningful ways? Probably not. So the examples we gave were not particularly good ones for that. So I'll have to study California. Do Californians have an identity, and what does that sound like? It might be worth thinking about that question, because it is a very multilingual, multicultural, multi-religious, or you get the point I'm trying to make here. So I think it's worth, I guess New York City has an identity, right? I guess I'd be curious to find out what people would say if you asked them, but it's like a question where I'm going to think about this question more because we haven't answered it well on this panel. It's a hard question. I think needs to be a better answer to this question.
Well, I am even thinking, we ask a question about whether like openness to people from around the world is a defining characteristic of what the nation is. And a large number of, a clear majority of Americans say yes, but there's a big partisan divide on that, right? So Democrats really think that that's a defining characteristic of our national identity, and Republicans are more divided on that. So I think even then, you can kind of come up with a concept, but the question is, how do you come up with a concept that everyone kind of agrees on? So.
Well, I will say we had a talk about attitudes and support for democracy, and we wound up focusing on divides over identity, which I think is quite telling.
Yeah.
And that is a real challenge to democracy. And so, you want to add anything, Vanessa?
Oh, well, I'm on the spot.
Yes.
I guess I would say this. James Baldwin writes famously that it is our job to achieve our country. And in any emergency, quote James Baldwin, you'll be all right. And that, to me, I think is the great question, right? How do we look honestly at our past and the ways in which we failed to achieve the ideals that we have often stated as our founding principles? And how do we find an identity that will look forward and actually achieve those goals? I think that is the great question.
James Baldwin for the win.
Always.
Yes. All right, thank you. Thanks for our panel.